Welcome to Current Affairs. I am not Nathan Robinson. This is Malaika Jabali joining Nathan as the co-host for today's episode. Nathan, how you doing?
Hey, Malaika, nice to have you. Nice to have you doing it instead of me. I'm so sick of doing that introduction.
So we are joined by the esteemed professor, Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley. He is the distinguished professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. He has written some seminal work, including Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, and Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression. Dr. Kelley, it is so nice to have you.
Oh, the honor is mine, especially to be with the both of you. And Malika, I'm your number one fan.
I appreciate that. And I too am a fan of yours. We wanted to have Dr. Kelley on today because it stemmed from the debate with Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, where he talks about her being a Marxist. And we decided, why not have the expert, one of the premier experts on Marxism, dispel some of those things, dispel what we mean when we talk about Marxism. And there's been a lot of fear mongering. I feel like this happens every election cycle, especially recently, where people start calling Democrats Marxists and socialists, and they're doing this to consolidate power, right, to organize their base. So we just wanted to ask you, first off, as the expert, is Kamala Harris a Marxist?
Absolutely not. Not even close. She's a kind of centrist liberal who comes out of law enforcement, basically. But there's a story to tell, though. I mean, part of the reason why it's not just Trump, but the whole Project 2025 people are attacking Kamala Harris because of her dad. So Donald Harris is an economist. He worked in Jamaica for the government. His first book, it wasn't a Marxist text, but it was a text on political economy published by Monthly Review Press, which was considered, the left press. And so they do that. But what they don't talk about, and now I'm going to expose some stuff, maybe I'll get in trouble, is her mother, Shamala Gopalan, who most people don't know was at Berkeley in the late 50s. And one of her best friends was my mentor, Cedric Robinson. They met when they were actually on the way. They were actually standing in line to register, because back in those days, UC was free. Let me repeat that. University of California was free.
I can't.
And they were registering. And she comes from India, and they strike up a conversation. And she ends up in a bunch of circles, left Black study circles. They were creating Black studies. Donald Warden. Nebbie Lou Crawford, they were all together hanging out. And she was in the room in those debates talking about what it means to basically write the Black radical tradition. So she's way more radical than her husband, than Kamala's father. So
you're furnishing all the material for the next attack ads, you realize.
Yeah. But I have to say, I don't know what her relationship, I can't speak to her relationship, but I have to say that if her politics, in other words, if Shamala Harris's politics remain the same, my guess is that she'd be rolling over in her grave, just embarrassed by her daughter, because her daughter's the very antithesis of a kind of radical politics. People get mad at me about that, but I don't care. I'm not running for office. So.
For most Americans, probably their only exposure to even the word Marxism comes in the form of these attacks from the right. You've made a very strong statement there, a couple of very strong statements, that Kamala Harris definitely not a Marxist, and that Kamala Harris's mother, who was steeped in the Black radical tradition, that was the kind of politics that would be anathema. So tell us a bit more about why that is. What the size of the gap between a centrist liberal and a Marxist is.
Right. Well, maybe the best way to approach is to talk about what is Marxism, because I think there are a lot of leftists who are not Marxists, and in fact, there's sort of two levels to think about this. One is the epithet of being a communist or a Marxist, which has little to do with what people really are doing or thinking. It's kind of like critical race theory. Most people use critical race theory as an epithet to attack people and to kind of paint a certain picture, which has little to do with what the analysis says. So Marxism fundamentally is a set of ideas rooted in what Antonio Gramsci calls a philosophy of practice, and that it's not ironclad laws of human development. It's Marx and Engels and all the people around him in the 19th century, building on 18th and 17th century ideas about socialism, ideas about capitalism, how it works. And so it's called Marxism because Marx himself had put together both the sort of ideas of Hegel and the ideas of dialectic. He put together the ideas of economists like Ricardo and Adam Smith, who talked about kind of labor theory of value. And he put together a kind of historical interpretation based on the French Revolution. And that is the sort of three pillars are the French Revolution, class struggle, that is that the society's divided into classes, and that those struggles between antagonistic classes are the driver, the motive force of history. The political economy part is basically that wealth is produced as a result of labor, that all wealth, which is we call surplus value is the amount of value that exceeds how much labor power goes into making a thing, right? I know that seems kind of abstract, but what they're saying is that, there's no such thing as like wealth in just real estate or wealth in like buying a tree. The wealth is how you transform those things into value. And so for the labor theory of value is that if all wealth, if all capital is produced as a result of labor, then the way wealth is produced is through the exploitation of labor. And part of the struggle against capitalism is to try to get that surplus back and turn it back into something that is creative and productive, useful, socially useful for humankind, and once you do that, according to Marxism, it means taking the class that controls or that exploits that labor power, removing them, eliminating them, and allowing those who make and create, that is the workers, to benefit and enjoy the fruits of their labor, And so those are the basic dimensions. Now, when we talk about philosophy of practice, it means that whatever Marxism might be at one point, it continues to change. Because if anything, it's less an ideology than an analysis, a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding like what causes change. Now, in the 19th century, people thought you could figure stuff out by reading the Bible, that God causes change, Other people like, ideas, like smart ideas cause change. And what Marx and Engels were saying, he said, we live in a material world. And historical materialism means that if these antagonistic classes are struggling, that whatever they produce in the end, that's what changes the world. That's what changes the conditions, that is material, those kind of material realities in the struggles around resources, for example. So that means that they're not waiting for some hidden hand or some magical sort of force to make change, or really smart people. It's not great men who make change, but it's that struggle, the class struggle, that makes change.
Mm-hmm. Now, with that class struggle, we anticipate, under Marxism, that the proletariat will understand, like they'll be able to use that kind of analysis to engage in the class struggle. But we also have an ownership class that has so much propaganda. And then when we hear, people like Donald Trump fear-mongering and even Democrats who disassociate from these labels, and as you say, these are different ways of thinking about the world. But why is it so scary for the proletariat to think about these ideas? What makes it so scary to the ownership class?
Right. Well, there's a couple of things. You use the P word on the radio. So proletariat refers specifically to kind of industrial working classes, to those who are producing the wealth. And I want to say this first before I answer the question, because when we use terms like proletariat, when Marx uses it, he's thinking about what it means to be a class for itself. That is, to be self-conscious as a proletariat. We live in a world where it's exactly what you're saying. There's a kind of narrative. Some people could call it propaganda. Some people could call it ideology or culture. A narrative that actually precludes those of us in the United States from using proletariat. What do we call ourselves? Not us, but most people call themselves middle class. Whether it's the Republicans or Democrats, when they get up on the podium, who are they trying to save? The middle class. No one says the working class except for maybe Bernie Sanders, right? They say the middle class because they're avoiding two things. One, the idea that workers actually do produce wealth. And two, that there's class antagonisms. Because middle class literally means you're in the middle, so therefore you're good. And you're like the heart and soul of America, right? So some of these terms that we use reveal or expose the antagonistic relationships. And the terms that, the liberals use are meant to tap those down. And so how does this work? Well, we've had not just like 70 years of anti-communism, we've had a century of anti-communism, going back over 150 years, going back to the Paris Commune. Anti-communism is like, it's like racism and anti-Semitism. That is to say, you attribute characteristics to people that are immutable and call them communists. So a communist is not someone in terms of popular parlance who says, you know what, I think capitalism is really unfair, and I think we need to redistribute the wealth. That's not what you think of. When you say the word communist, and goes back to Trump's rhetoric, not just Trump's rhetoric, but everyone's rhetoric. When you say communist, you're saying someone who believes in violence, someone who believes in gulags, and that the wealthy class is going to have to be hanged. People who believe that life will be long lines of waiting for poor goods. I mean, all the mythologies that center around communist regimes. You talk about famine in China. These are the ways that they use communism. And you also think about communists as agents who are collecting information on behalf of a foreign entity. Now, I was a communist, and I didn't do any of that stuff. None of it. In fact, I went to parties. I had fun, read books, and we tried to change the conditions of all the people who are struggling, whether they're undocumented workers, whether they're underpaid laborers, whether they're Black and brown people who are getting beat up by the police. This is what communists do because they try to create a fair society. But that's not the discourse. So once you use a buzzword like communism, you can basically vilify the Democrats, Kamala Harris, and everyone else. And what do they do in response? What they do is they do the same thing. Like, I'm not anything close to a communist. In fact, I fight for the middle class, and I fight for free enterprise, and I fight for capitalism. Again, except for Bernie Sanders, there's no major politician willing to say capitalism is a messed up thing. They're not willing to say that. They need to read your book, right? But Obviously, they haven't. So they don't think about that, and it doesn't work because the myth around the middle class is to suggest that all we have to do is tweak the system to make it more fair, because we have no problems with the Elon Musks of the world. In fact, being middle class means having dreams of being the owner of a company. Entrepreneurship is part of the buzzword of like, how do you rise from the lower orders into the upper orders? How do you rise out of the middle class? In fact, no one is making the case that everyone should stay in the middle class. They're like, these are the great people, these are people, but ultimately, let's rise, right? So there's a kind of equally so. I mean, the Republicans and Democrats have a kind of equal, they're equally enamored with capitalism as a system, and they do not see it as flawed inherently, and they don't see that poverty is produced out of the system. They see poverty still as a result of bad choices.
That kind of gets to the other half of the question that I had about the gap between Kamala and a Marxist. You gave us a very beautiful and clear, succinct explanation of the basic tenets of Marxism, and what an actual Marxist believes. The other half of it is, well, what is it that Kamala Harris's particular ideology is? Does she have an ideology? One might be tempted to sort of see her as a careerist politician whose beliefs are opportunistic. Can we identify, if she is clearly not a Marxist because it doesn't hold any of the tenets that you laid out as the basic principles of Marxism? And you said, Marxism is a worldview. It's a way of understanding the world. Someone like her, you've given some hints there as to what their kind of ideology, their kind of worldview might be.
Right. Okay, so I would say that Kamala Harris, like many people in her circle, I would define them as law and order liberals. She is a liberal, and liberal is a term whose meaning has changed. And I think to understand like how it's changed, because you could say she's a law and order neoliberal, which I think is really quite accurate, but we got to be clear. Liberalism is the ideology of capitalism. It's not sort of what we think of as the right, because even the far right is built on liberalism. What is liberalism? Liberalism is the rule of law, free markets, free trade, as little of a presence of the state as possible, kind of laissez-faire, right? And liberalism, modern Western liberalism, because liberalism is Western, developed in the 18th century around the idea that European man is the definition of the human. That's why liberalism in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries has there's no contradiction between being a liberal who believes in rule of law, free trade, free enterprise, all that stuff, and promoting slavery. So liberalism is not against slavery. Liberalism is against the slavery of humans, and that would be European man. So much, and Marx himself had a critique of slavery. He was very sharp about this. And Marx comes out of liberalism. He had to break from liberalism. I mean, Marx wasn't necessarily against capitalism. He loved capitalism. He felt that capitalism would develop the productive forces to such a degree that as much harm as it does, it's going to eventually be crushed by the proletariat, because that's their historical duty, to crush it, overthrow it. And what do they inherit?
Can I just say
the stuff that comes with it?
That statement, I just want to linger on that, because that is a major misunderstanding of Marx that people have. When you said Marx was very impressed by and amazed by capitalism. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and that's why, he didn't write 3 volumes called Socialism. He wrote 3 volumes on capital. And he wanted to understand how it worked. That's not to say that he loved the outcome of it. he just felt like if you think about the world in stages, history in stages, that the stage of capitalist development he considered one of the most important stages because you cannot make the leap to socialism without the productive forces being developed. Now, I'm saying all this stuff, I'm basically parroting Marx's ideas. I'm not saying what I think or what Cedric Robinson taught me, which is to say—
we want to get to that, actually.
Yeah, we'll get to that. And that's a different thing, and because it's a critique of that. But to go back to liberalism, I think we have to really understand what it is. Even Marx was a proponent of free trade, no tariffs. Free trade basically means like you reduce to no tariff, so you're not going to add a tax when you have an import or something like that, which is a way that states gain revenues. So now we move forward. Liberalism in the late 19th century, in the Gilded Age, in the age of extreme wealth, when you actually have like monopolies, where all the stuff about competition goes out the window. like capitalists don't like competition. They do not. They say it, but in the age of monopoly, which is fundamentally we're still there. They want to eliminate competition, consolidate, and concentrate capital so that they can continue to keep prices high and the costs of labor low, production costs low, and profits super high. Competition means that sometimes you're going to reduce your prices in competition. But if you basically corner the market on whatever it is you're selling or whatever services you're providing, then you don't have to do that so much unless government steps in. So liberals don't like government. That's the real liberalism of the 19th century. Get to the early 20th century, liberal changes meaning. It becomes kind of like big government because now liberals converge with progressives. And progressives are like, we're not against capitalism, but this child labor stuff is kind of jacked up. Can't be, we shouldn't be making 4-year-olds work. Or we actually need to have more democracy. So we should have referenda. And in fact, we should do stuff like tax income. Have income tax in the 20th century. We should elect senators. I mean, these are the kinds of things that progressives end up pushing for. And that it stands in for liberalism, right? And what's so amazing about this moment is that the same people, progressives and liberals, believe in what? Social Darwinism and eugenics. Because they're trying to create an efficient world, efficient government, right? Efficient economy, and efficient human beings. And that means eugenics meant we're going to use all forms of birth control and sterilization to make sure that the feeble-minded and the Negroes can't produce too many of these people because that undermines our stock, our racial stock. And some people say, well, that's contradictory. Of course, it's not contradictory because still, if the definition of the human still centers on like European man, then all these other people are still struggling for a place in humanity, right? But then this happens, 1920s comes along, 30s. All these other liberals are like, you know what? That liberalism is bogus. We want to go back to the old one, but instead of laissez-faire, we're going to create a liberalism that's free trade, free markets, all that stuff, except that we're going to create governmental and institutional forms to protect capital. And that's the neoliberal. The neoliberals like, we like the old liberalism, but we don't like the laissez-faire. We don't like government unless government protects capital. And so as we move into the 20th century, the idea that, the most extreme version of bailouts, right? But besides bailouts, think about what it means when neoliberals are saying in the 1940s that the mineral wealth of the Congo or Peru and the agricultural wealth of Guatemala doesn't belong to the people, it belongs to capital. That capital has to be protected, its right to extract wealth. And states should not have the right to nationalize those resources, to basically block capital from coming in. And that's also anti-communist. It's like saying, we hate communism and socialism, and we hate a kind of capitalism that allows for states to make these decisions. And we're going to go up against that. As we move forward, neoliberalism takes on even more. So part of neoliberal order is saying that privatization or private ownership is the most efficient way to fix society. So healthcare, you want to make good healthcare, make it competitive or monopoly, but make it competitive, put it on the market. You want to deal with Social Security? Well, invest it. You want to deal with public parks? Why should the state or municipalities be responsible when we could have a company rename the park and they could charge people to come in? I mean, there's all these different ways in which the neoliberal order is saying that the private sector or the public-private partnership should be driven by the private sector. That is Kamala Harris. That is Joe Biden. That is Barack Obama. That is Ronald Reagan. That is George Bush. In other words, across the board, they have all embraced the neoliberal order. And with that, you eliminate what's considered to be the fetters on government. Welfare. It was Bill Clinton that basically destroyed welfare as we knew it, which was fought for by working people and by women who insisted that given the unpaid labor that they engage in a market economy that is sexist and racist, that they have they're entitled to a social safety net. And suddenly that becomes, oh, wait, that's a burden. Oh, God, you're just dependent. You need to get off your butt. In fact, let's give it a welfare. Instead of receiving a check, you all need to come and clean the trains, clean the A train and the D train. Even though you're getting paid less than union wages, that's going to be the way to earn money so that you as a single parent, could take care of your children, which is still below the poverty line. So that is neoliberal. By the time we get to Kamala Harris, who look, to her credit, there's some things I would agree with. I would agree with like trying to deal with price gouging or trying to deal with the grossly underpaid home care health workers. Like these are good things. These are not bad things. But the general tenor is that business needs support. Business is the driver. Business creates jobs. Business, and law and order is the only way. That is more prisons, more police, more repression, because that's how you create the conditions for capital to thrive. And that's, for me, and I think for all of us, that's how you create the conditions for misery among people who they keep calling middle class, but they end up being left alone.
Right. And I think one of the things that's important to glean from this very comprehensive history you laid out about liberalism is that you didn't mention party. You didn't mention Democrat or Republican. Both of our major political parties, they believe in these ideals of protecting capital pretty much at all costs. And so when we even think about this election cycle, without a kind of Bernie Sanders figure in the upcoming presidential election, we don't have that conversation about the working class. We don't even have some of the progressive ideas and policies that were becoming popularized. I haven't heard Medicare for all in mainstream news. I can't even tell you the last time I heard that. Free college tuition. We got to go back in a time machine to your days when it was $90. I think I read for a year. We're not talking about that. We're barely even talking about Biden's student debt cancellation plan. And so I'm curious, because we have constrained the narrative so much, and because people have so many misconceptions about these other modes of production, because communism is a slur, how do leftists like yourself, how do the readers and the audience and the listeners to current affairs, how do they navigate that?
Well, we go on current affairs.
I agree with this.
Good listeners
Subscribe. And buy Malaika's book,
you know,
too, which will help you.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And
or Robin's or Nathan's.
Yeah, all of our books. Buy all of our books. This is how you navigate.
But specifically Malaika's book, I just have to put a plug in because the book really breaks down how capitalism works and also the violence of it in a way that people could really understand and connect to. Because unfortunately, we live in a culture right now where it's very hard to get that message out. And this is why. One of the things that capitalism did to its development in the 20th and 21st century is that it turned the working class into middle class and middle class into consumers. And so consumption has been made easier by algorithms, by the internet, to the point where people are just, they push buttons, and there's a kind of consumption which is tied to like TikTok, for example. I'm sure TikTok is great. My daughter is like addicted to them. And so TikTok, then she comes back to me and she says, I want to remake my room. And then she finds the picture. It's like, this is how I want it. I said, well, that keyboard doesn't, I don't care. I want that keyboard. I want that monitor. I want that. And so it's hard to even imagine what a collective economy geared toward care would look like when you are being sold a bill of goods, which means that you don't exist until you have those curtains or those shoes. And I've seen consumerism, but not like this. This is really, really, really hard. And the fact that consumption is tied to our actual self-identity. So what's beautiful about the book is that by thinking about capitalism as a relationship, right, that you have to break up with, it's like now you're getting like actual relationship. Like it's like a self-help, like the self-help book. You're getting relationship advice. And that's what people want. They go on TikTok because they try to get a man or a woman or a partner, or they're trying to, be hip. And in some ways, to be hip is to recognize that your partner is abusing you. And that is the book. Capitalism is abusing us, and abuse sometimes not recognized. And socialism has been abused. It's like you got the good, partner across the way, but people keep saying, well, they're like broke, they're funny looking,
they're not fun.
They're not fun. You got to stand in line to get a kiss.
Right.
And don't deal with those people. And besides that, they're violent and dangerous, and they're a threat to you when you're being beaten. And so it's amazing. Just one, it's not a side note, but it's actually relevant. The history of capitalism is a violent one. And yet it's the discourse on the violence of socialist countries that's being used as evidence that it doesn't work. Now, meanwhile, you've got more massacres in industrial deaths, in wars as a result of capitalist production than any other system on the planet. And yet it's China and the Soviet Union. I'm not saying they're perfect and they're problematic, but the crimes of Mao and Stalin are the only ones that matter, And when you do like the ledger on what they produce and what the capitalist world produced, we have both fast death and slow death. No matter what people may say about the Eastern Bloc countries, there's certain things that we know are facts. One is that rent was super low. Period. It just was. In some cases, you didn't pay rent. So people say the rent's too damn high. Well, go to Czechoslovakia. It's much better. Back in those days, we know that you had pretty much full employment, which is not the case in the Western capitalist countries. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. You didn't have freedom of the press and stuff. But do we have freedom of the press here? I mean, in a sense, given the fact that we're having a conversation about what the press doesn't say, what they refuse to say, what they refuse to not, you're right. No one's talking about Medicare for all, and nothing's stopping the press from saying, well, what happened to that idea? Nothing stopping the press from running a long piece in the New York Times Magazine that says, this is what single payer healthcare looks like, and this is how it works. But they don't do that, right? So again, it's easy to vilify existing socialism or socialist experiments without looking at the history to figure out why it collapsed or what happened. And it's lots of reasons. Sometimes that collapse has to do with outside forces, capitalist countries, interventions, assassinations. Sometimes that's to do with internal dynamics. But if we're going to think about what a future looks like that is non-capitalist, we have to be more imaginative. We don't have to replicate what's gone on in the past, but the way we need to think about whether we call it socialism or something else is we got to think about it primarily in ethical terms. In ethical terms, if we get caught up, I believe, and I'm an old person, so I've tried everything. But if we get caught up in, okay, this is inevitable, capitalism is going to collapse. Well, that's not true. We've been saying that for a long time. It has to be dismantled, number one. But if you say it's inevitable, or if you say, it's the most efficient system, or if you say, look at the contradictions of capitalist periodic crises, that stuff is not effective. But if we say this is really unethical to have, 60,000 people without a home in one small city, or people dying because they can't afford the medication, or all the things that happen, even the issue of reproductive rights. There's no possible way that we can separate the denial of reproductive rights from capitalism itself. There's all kinds of ways in which they're related. But the most important thing for me is like, ethically, what kind of world do we want? And how do we build it? And if someone could prove to me that all the things that could create an ethical, beautiful, loving, caring society can be done under capitalism, prove it. There's no historical precedent for that. You can't prove it. So even if the so-called socialist countries haven't been able to produce some of it, they produce some of it, not all of it. That doesn't mean we can't. But the only way we can do it is if we have a vision that's based on a certain kind of ethical behavior and a love for each other. That's the harder work. Then, you could read all kind of volumes of Marx and the Grundrisse and, German ideology and civil war in France, but that's not going to get to the issue. How do we make an ethical society?
You've touched in a couple of your answers on the way in which studying the actual history of what socialists and communists have done is very important to dispelling these kinds of misconceptions. You became a historian yourself. One of your major contributions, if our listeners don't know, is your excavation of the history of Alabama communists in the 30s and 40s, understanding what they actually did, understanding what the proud history of the left in the United States, which had been kind of suppressed. In fact, leftists in the U.S., radical leftists, have been on the forefront of the fight for civil liberties, for free speech. It's a very noble and great tradition. I wanted to though to get to the question which you touched on just at the end there as to how we need to and ought to modify or adapt classical Marxism, because I think you're a particularly interesting person to have on, because even though obviously you're grounded in Marxist thought, you understand it very well. It's influenced you. You have modified and adapted it, and you draw from many different currents. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think you've already touched on one thing, which is you say that as opposed to kind of rigid Marxism that sees capitalism as destined to destroy itself by its contradictions, you believe that that's not going to happen and we need an ethical analysis, which often is kind of excluded from classical Marxism. What are the other ways in which you think, what is kind of living in Marxism, and what are the things that you think it really, really needs in order to be relevant for our time?
Right. Well, one of the things that I've learned, and again, I want to give credit to the most important teacher I had besides my mother, which was Cedric Robinson, who wrote Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, and wrote a number of other books. He also wrote a book called The Anthropology of Marxism, which I think people should read. And one of the things that I learned was that as much as I love Marx's writing and thinking, as much as he's evolved over the years, especially his later writings when he's in Algeria, is that his Marxism was never really universal. It was based on an analysis of Western Europe. In fact, in some ways, Capital is based on analysis of England, specifically. And I'm not faulting that, but what happens is that if you universalize the Western proletariat, and you imagine that is the dominant driving force, the vanguard of making revolution, and you don't acknowledge the fact that the vast majority of people, especially in the period that Marx is writing, are peasants. They're rural people, sometimes having plots of land. There's huge numbers who are enslaved. There's huge numbers who are dispossessed. There's huge indigenous groups around the world whose relationship to economy is very different, and their relationship to ideas are very different. And so one of the terms that has been used, bandied about, is racial capitalism. We can call it gendered, racial, colonial capitalism. We could use all kinds of adjectives. It's still capitalism, but what it does is it acknowledges that capitalism emerged within a particular civilization. Its vision was, and the critique of capitalism emerged within a particular civilization in which it imagined taking the best of the productive forces of Western Europe and, replicating them around the world. And it also assumed that there was such a thing as a proletariat, as a self-conscious entity, when the same people are traveling around the world and discovering different kind of communities, Maroons, indigenous groups, Africans whose philosophy, whose ontology, whose ways of being, don't make a distinction between individuals, but see themselves as one, right? We are Ubuntu, for example. I mean, all these different ideas can be the basis of a new society. And it could be the basis of new forms of production. And it also makes us recognize that even the most vibrant uprisings in the 19th and 20th century have not been the proletariat. They've been peasant rebellions. They've been slave rebellions. I mean, the most important revolution in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century was the Haitian Revolution, right? These were enslaved people. It was way more important than the American Revolution, because the American Revolution pretty much it just allowed the bourgeoisie to control trade, right? And so once we think of history differently and think of movements differently, we have things to draw on. And finally, the most obvious thing is that, and this is my critique of a lot of Marxists of a particular generation, they took to heart Marx's appreciation for industrial capitalism without actually recognizing the way industrial capitalism destroys the planet, right? The ecological disaster that's resulting from all this development. So there's a way in which we need to industrialize and advance, and we need more and more machinery, more technology, when that's also destroying our planet. And now you've got eco-Marxists, eco-surrealists, all these different people, eco-feminists, who are saying, how do we develop not just new forms of technology that allow us to preserve the planet, preserve life, but how do we change our thinking so that we don't think of history in teleologies, right? Always moving forward and upwards, always advancing mechanically, because sometimes the things that our ancestors did are 10 times smarter than the things, right?
So, Dr. Kelley, you've been talking about sort of the Eurocentrism of the way that leftists have kind of been analyzing the world, and Marx himself, where not just Eurocentric, but maybe just specifically looking at one country in the globe.
Right.
So are there, you've written about the Black radical imagination. Are there any sort of non-Western examples of resistance and revolution that have inspired you over the years? Or I would say even a contemporary example. Where do you see some of this happening in practice right now?
Right. Why could this be autobiographical? I mean, I came up, I graduated from high school in 1980 and got to college. And so the revolution in Grenada, 1979 to 1983 was a huge thing. Of course, in hindsight, we realize there were some errors, but Grenada was the first English-speaking country in the Western Hemisphere to have a socialist revolution, and it was eventually overthrown. That inspired me, as did reading Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which was first published in 1972, but had a huge impact on me as someone working on Africa. And I should say, I went to graduate school to study Africa. So my models of revolution were not in the West. They were Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola. They were also Vietnam. They were, this was the era in the post-war period of insurgencies in which peasants and workers and the actual middle class, that is to say, the class of the petty bourgeoisie, who's like clerks and things under the colonial system, that's when they were trying to really, really remake those societies. They didn't succeed always, but they were trying to do things that wasn't in the imagination of either Marx or Lenin or Kautsky or Trotsky or any of those folks. They were doing something new that was about empowering ordinary people, providing forms of popular education. And the problem was with these revolutions is that you really can't have a full, complete revolution if you have no wealth. And these were revolutions of the poor. And once you have a revolution of the poor, as beautiful as it might be, if the rest of the world is against you, they will jack you up. So part of the lesson to me is that even in Chiapas, for example, which was, I think, is an astounding example of rebellion and uprising, if the whole world is arrayed against you, that is to say, the global North, then there's no way that, well, let me put it another way. Almost all the leaders of these revolutions were assassinated at some point, or their regimes were overthrown. And that's why, in the end, for all the revolutions and revolts that might inspire me, if there's a takeaway, it's this. You cannot have a true, genuine anti-capitalist revolution unless you could stop capitalism everywhere. It must be global. And that includes all the struggling people in Western Europe, who are also suffering under regime. We may not be equal, but we've got to basically dismantle this whole thing on a global scale. Otherwise, there will always be pockets vulnerable to the violence of especially the United States.
I hope that our listeners and readers will also check out the previous interview that you did on our program where we talked about your book, Freedom Dreams, because there you outline a lot of, not just in not just practice, but vision. And we discussed a lot of the various different visions people have had over the years in the Black radical tradition for remaking, for building a better world. I think it serves as an excellent supplement to what you've just given us there. So we thank you, Dr. Kelley, for coming on. U.S. political discourse is so stunted, superficial, and stupid that terms like Marxism and communism and socialism are just used in ways that are entirely divorced from any serious understanding or from any of the ideas that are actually promulgated by people who would self-apply those labels. And out of frustration at that, Malaika suggested, well, why don't we talk to an actual expert in the subject? And you obviously came to mind as the first person we thought of to illuminate us and hopefully illuminate our listeners and readers as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's always an honor.